The cold November air inside the Redemption Ridge Bank was thick with the scent of old paper and desperation. Mabel Sheridan clutched the worn strap of her reticule, her knuckles white. Across the polished mahogany desk, Mr. Abernathy, the bank's chief clerk, peered at her over his spectacles, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Sheridan," he began, his voice a dry rustle of ledger pages. "I understand your position, truly I do. But Mr. Carter has been exceptionally clear. The loan is past due and without a substantial payment. I just need a little more time." Mabel pleaded, her voice quiet but firm. "The winter cattle sale is in 6 weeks. If I can just hold on until then, I can make good on the debt. Thomas, my husband, he always said the Sheridan land was a promise. The Sheridan promise. I can't break it." Abernathy sighed, adjusting his green eye shade. "A promise is a fine thing, ma'am, but it doesn't satisfy the bank's investors." He was about to offer another platitude when the front door of the bank flew open, with a violent crash slamming against the interior wall. 2 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, stormed in. The taller one brandished a Colt Peacemaker, its long barrel sweeping across the room with lethal intent. The other, broader and shorter, carried a heavy canvas sack. "Nobody move," the tall one barked, his voice muffled but clear. "This is a robbery." The bank's 2 other customers, a rancher and his wife, froze in place. Abernathy's hands shot into the air, his face turning the color of old parchment. Mabel felt a cold dread seep into her bones, but her first instinct was for her son. Denver was safe at the schoolhouse, thank God. She remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the robbers. "You," the shorter man grunted, pointing at Abernathy. "Get the money, all of it, and be quick about it." As Abernathy scrambled to obey, the taller bandit's eyes roved the room searching for other valuables. They settled on a small glass display case near the teller's window, a collection of items held as collateral or left in safekeeping. His gaze locked onto a single object glinting under the lamplight, a silver pocket watch, its surface intricately engraved. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas's watch. His father had given it to him, and he had carried it every day of their life together. After his death, it was the one tangible piece of him. She had left a silent, ticking reminder of the man she had loved. She'd brought it to the bank months ago, a desperate move to secure a small extension, praying she'd be able to reclaim it before anyone noticed. The bandit moved toward the case. "No," Mabel whispered, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. His head snapped in her direction. "What did you say?" She swallowed, trying to find her voice. "Please," she said louder this time. "Take anything else? That watch? It was my husband's." The bandit chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound. "Looks like it's my watch now." He lifted the butt of his pistol and with a swift, brutal motion shattered the glass case. The sound echoed through the silent bank like a gunshot. Shards of glass rained down onto the floor. He reached through the jagged opening, his gloved fingers closing around the silver watch. He glanced at it for a moment, then shoved it deep into his pocket. The act felt more violent than the smashing of the glass, more personal than the pointing of the gun. It was as if he had reached into her chest and had stolen a piece of her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and angry. "We got it," the other robber called from behind the counter, hoisting the heavy sack. "Let's go," the tall one ordered. They backed toward the door, their guns still trained on the terrified occupants. In less than a minute, they were gone, the sound of their horses' hooves fading into the cold November air. For a long moment, the only sound in the bank was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the soft crunch of broken glass under Abernathy's feet as he slowly emerged from behind the counter. The rancher's wife began to sob quietly. Mabel didn't move. She stared at the empty space in the shattered display case, a hollow ache spreading through her. They had taken the bank's money, but they had stolen her past. The cold, hard reality of her situation settled upon her. Not only was her ranch on the verge of collapse, but now the last precious memento of the man she'd built it with was gone lost to the casual cruelty of a common thief. The Sheridan promise felt more broken than ever. The aftermath of the robbery draped Redemption Ridge in a pall of fear and suspicion. Sheriff Bradley, a man whose weary posture seemed to carry the weight of every crime he'd failed to solve, asked his questions and made his notes. But everyone knew the bandits were long gone. The town buzzed with gossip, but for Mabel, the noise was a distant hum. Her world had narrowed to the failing ranch, her son's worried eyes, and the ghost of a silver watch. The Sheridan promise was more than land. It was a legacy. Thomas had poured his sweat and dreams into its soil. Now the fences sagged, the herd had dwindled, and the barn roof leaked in 3 different places. Denver, her bright 8-year-old son, was the reason she fought. His laughter was the only thing that kept the encroaching despair at bay. But his innocent questions about their future were a constant, painful reminder of her vulnerability. 2 days after the robbery, Wyatt Carter paid her a visit. He owned the bank, half the businesses on Main Street, and an ambition that seemed to have no horizon. He arrived in a polished black buggy, his suit immaculate against the dusty backdrop of her ranch. He found her patching a section of the barn wall, a task far beyond her strength. "Mrs. Sheridan," he said, his voice smooth as riverstone. "A difficult week for us all." Mabel nodded, not stopping her work. "Mr. Carter." He surveyed the ranch with a proprietor's eye, his gaze lingering on the signs of neglect. "The robbery was most unfortunate. A sign of the times, I'm afraid. Lawlessness is a disease, and it seems our town is falling ill." He stepped closer. "It also complicates your financial situation." "I'm aware," she said, her voice tight. "The board is concerned," he continued. "They see the robbery as a sign of instability. They're pressuring me to call in all outstanding debts, especially those tied to properties that are, shall we say, underperforming." Mabel finally stopped turning to face him. The hammer felt heavy in her hand. "What are you saying?" Wyatt's smile was a thin, bloodless line. "I'm saying I have a solution, a way to secure your future and Denver's, a way to make the Sheridan promise solvent once more." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I am prepared to forgive your entire debt, Mrs. Sheridan. I will personally invest in the ranch, restore it to its former glory." Mabel stared at him, suspicion coiling in her gut. "In exchange for what?" "Your hand in marriage." He said the words delivered with the cold precision of a business transaction. "A union between us would be mutually beneficial. You would gain security and stability. I would gain a respectable wife and a home. It is the most logical arrangement." The offer was as cold and hard as a winter frost. He wasn't proposing marriage. He was executing a merger. It was a generous offer on paper, but his calculating demeanor, the way his eyes held no warmth, suggested a motive that ran deeper than simple convenience. As he spoke, Mabel's gaze drifted past him toward the edge of town. She saw a figure hunched over a pile of scrap wood behind the carpenter's shop. It was Luther Beck, the town's handyman. People called him simple, a gentle giant whose mind had never quite caught up with his body. He was quietly, methodically sorting lumber, but as Wyatt Carter's buggy had passed, she saw him pause and watch it with an unusual intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a fleeting expression, quickly replaced by his usual placid demeanor, but Mabel filed it away. I'll need time to think, she told Wyatt, her mind reeling. Of course, he said, his smile never wavering. But don't take too long. Logic, like time, waits for no one. That evening, the town council convened an emergency meeting in Calvin Sawyer's saloon, the Gilded Cage. Calvin was a shrewd businessman, but a fair one, a mountain of a man, whose gruff exterior hid a surprisingly sharp mind. He watched from behind his bar as the town's most influential men gathered, Sheriff Bradley among them, looking more exhausted than ever. Mabel arrived late, her shawl pulled tight against the biting wind. The warm, smoky air of the saloon felt suffocating. All eyes turned to her as she entered. Wyatt Carter stood at the head of a long poker table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Ah, Mrs. Sheridan," he said, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "Thank you for joining us. We were just discussing matters of civic importance, namely, the stability of our community." He launched into a speech about the recent robbery, the failing ranches, and the decline in property values. He painted a picture of a town on the brink of collapse, a community in desperate need of strong leadership and sound financial footing. Then, he turned his gaze directly on Mabel. The Sheridan Ranch, he announced, is a cornerstone of this valley. Its failure would be a blow from which we might not recover. He let the dramatic statement hang in the air before continuing. Therefore, to secure its future, and by extension the future of our town, I have made Mrs. Sheridan a proposal. A murmur went through the room. Calvin Sawyer stopped polishing a glass, his eyes narrowing. "I have offered to forgive her debt and invest in her property," Wyatt declared, "in exchange for her hand in marriage." He raised his glass. "It is an arrangement that will benefit us all." The room was silent. Mabel felt the weight of every gaze, the pressure of their collective expectation. Wyatt had turned his private business proposition into a public spectacle, making it seem as if the town's survival depended on her answer. "He's a generous man, Mabel," one of the councilmen said. "You won't get a better offer," another added. Wyatt smiled, the picture of magnanimity. He set his glass down and walked toward her. "I know this is sudden," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, yet still loud enough for everyone to hear. "So I will give you time. You have until Christmas to accept my offer. If by then you have not, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. The decision is yours." It wasn't a proposal. It was an ultimatum. He had trapped her. If she refused, she wasn't just a widow losing her ranch. She was the selfish woman who endangered the entire town. Her fight was no longer just against a failing business. It was against the man who controlled everything, and he was orchestrating her downfall in plain sight. Mabel stood her ground, her spine rigid. "I appreciate the town's concern," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I will give your suggestion the consideration it deserves." She turned and walked out of the saloon, her head held high, leaving the councilmen to their whiskey and their judgment. Outside, the night was cold and dark, but a fire of defiance had been lit within her. Wyatt Carter thought he had her cornered. He was about to find out how fiercely a cornered woman could fight for her promise. Mabel refused to be broken. The day after the town meeting, she rose before the sun, a cold resolve settling over her. She would save the ranch on her own terms. She spent the morning mending harnesses and the afternoon calculating figures, trying to find a path through her debts that didn't lead to Wyatt Carter's door. But Wyatt had not been idle. His response to her defiance was not overt, but subtle and suffocating, like a slow tightening of a noose. The first sign came 3 days later. She rode out to check on her small herd and found a 20-foot section of her north fence cut clean through. The wire was snipped with precision not broken by weather or a stray animal. Half a dozen cattle had wandered off. and it took her the better part of the day to track them down in the rocky terrain near Miller's Creek. It was a setback she couldn't afford. The next day, she went to the general store to buy supplies on credit, as she always did between cattle sales. Mr. Morrison, a man she'd known her whole life, couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mabel," he mumbled, wringing his hands. "Mr. Carter at the bank. He called in my business loan. Said I had to tighten up my accounts. I can't extend any more credit. Cash only." The message was clear. Wyatt was choking off her resources, isolating her. As she stood at the counter, her small list of necessities seeming impossibly out of reach, a large shadow fell over her. "Fencing wire is expensive," a quiet voice said behind her. Mabel turned to find Luther Beck standing there, holding a spool of new wire and a bag of staples. His face was placid, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing of her predicament. "Saw your fence was down," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "This should be enough to fix it proper." He set the items on the counter and placed a few coins next to them. "And a bag of flour. A boy like Denver needs his biscuits." Mabel was speechless. "Luther, I can't—" "Not a gift," he said, though. His tone made it clear it was. "Just being neighborly." He gave her a slight nod, touched the brim of his worn hat, and was gone before she could protest further. The next morning, as she was struggling to stretch the new wire, Luther appeared at her ranch. He didn't ask for permission. He simply picked up a pair of pliers and went to work beside her. His hands, which seemed so large and clumsy, moved with an expert's grace. The fence post was set deep, the wire stretched taut and true. His work was meticulous, intelligent, a stark contradiction to his town reputation as a simpleton. They worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the snip of the pliers and the crisp winter air. Denver, home from school, came out to watch them, his initial wariness of the big, quiet man quickly turning into fascination. "Why do you twist the wire like that?" Denver asked. Luther paused carefully, showing the boy how he wrapped the end. "Makes it stronger," he explained in his direct, simple terms. "A good knot holds against pressure. A bad knot gives way when things get tough." His eyes flickered toward Mabel for a split second, and she knew he wasn't just talking about fences. She found herself watching him, intrigued. He spoke in short sentences, but his eyes were constantly observing, taking in the state of the barn and the health of the horses, the worried lines around her own eyes. A quiet, respectful bond began to form between them, an unspoken understanding that they were both outsiders in their own way. Though she remained wary, she was grateful for his help. She was no longer entirely alone. Her gratitude, however, did not dull her desperation. With her credit cut off and sabotage a constant threat, she realized waiting for the cattle sale was a fool's hope. There was only one other way to get the money she needed, recover what was stolen from the bank. More than the money, she wanted Thomas's watch back. Its recovery felt like the only way to reclaim a part of herself she had lost. Armed with a new sense of purpose, she began her own investigation. She started at the saloon, approaching Calvin Sawyer when the bar was quiet. "Calvin," she began, "the men who robbed the bank. Did anyone see them before or after?" Calvin polished the bar, his expression thoughtful. "Hard to say, Mabel. They were strangers. Rode in, did their business, and rode out. But—" He paused. "One of my regulars, old Jed, said he saw them watering their horses down by the old cottonwood grove an hour before the robbery. Said one of them was smoking a fancy cigar, the kind with a red band. You don't see many of those around here." It was a small detail, but it was a start. Her inquiries did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, Wyatt Carter cornered her outside the church. "Mrs. Sheridan," he said, his voice laced with disapproval, "I hear you've been asking questions about the robbery. I must advise you against it. It is improper for a lady to involve herself in such dangerous matters. It's a job for the sheriff. The sheriff has found nothing, she countered. That was my husband's watch they stole, Mr. Carter. It has value beyond money. Sentiment is a luxury, Mabel, he said coolly. Focus on practical matters, like our future. His attempt to dissuade her only strengthened her resolve. That evening, as Luther was helping Denver whittle a piece of wood, she mentioned the cigar. Luther looked up from his work, his brow furrowed. Red Band, he said. That's a cheroot. They're made over in the next territory in Blackstone. Expensive. Mabel was stunned. How would you know that? He shrugged his gaze, dropping back to the piece of wood. Just something a man picks up. The next day she rode out to the cottonwood grove Jed had mentioned. She spent an hour searching the ground, finding nothing but discarded tins and horse droppings. Disheartened, she was about to leave, when Luther appeared leading his horse. He carried a saddle blanket. Thought you might be out here, he said. He didn't explain how. Found this snagged on a branch downstream. It's not from around here. He laid the blanket on the ground. It was standard issue, but caked in one corner was a patch of dark, reddish mud, completely different from the pale sandy soil of Redemption Ridge. This mud, Luther said, crumbling a piece between his fingers. It's from the Blackstone River Basin, heavy in iron. He pointed to a faint mark on the leather trim of the blanket. And that brand. It's a double C. That's Clay Calloway's outfit. He runs a crew of hired guns out of Blackstone, men who'll do anything for the right price. Mabel stared at him, a dawning realization in her eyes. The cigar, the mud, the brand he saw, details no one else did. His insights were sharp, logical, and far beyond the capabilities of a simple man. She was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about Luther Beck. Their investigation had yielded a crucial lead. The robbers were not random bandits. They were hired professionals from a rival territory. They had been paid by an unknown party to rob the Redemption Ridge Bank. And Mabel had a growing, sickening suspicion about who in town had the money and the motive to arrange such a thing. Wyatt Carter felt the walls of his carefully constructed plan begin to crack. Mabel's persistence was becoming a liability. Her quiet investigation, aided by the town's simpleton, was stirring up dust he preferred to let settle. He had underestimated her resilience, and now he needed to remind her of her place. He sent word to Blackstone. The same two thugs who had robbed the bank were given new instructions: scare the widow. Scare her badly enough that she would run into his arms for protection. A few days later, Mabel rode out to the far pasture to check on a newborn calf. The sky was a vast, unforgiving gray, and the wind carried the first sharp bite of a coming snow. She found the calf huddled with its mother, safe and sound. A small wave of relief washed over her, a fleeting moment of peace in a world of turmoil. It didn't last. As she turned her horse to head back, two riders emerged from a thicket of barren aspens blocking her path. She recognized them instantly from the bank, even without their masks. The tall, lean one had the same cruel eyes, and the shorter, broader one sat his horse with the same brutish slump. "Well, look what we have here," the tall one said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. The little widow, all by herself. Mabel's hand instinctively went to the small rifle she kept in her saddle scabbard, but they were too close. They could draw and fire before she had a chance. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just a friendly conversation," the shorter one sneered. "Mr. Carter's getting impatient. He thinks maybe you need a little encouragement to see things his way. He's a good man offering you a fine home. A woman alone out here, it's a dangerous world." To emphasize his point, he spurred his horse forward, crowding her. Mabel's mare whinnied, nervously backing away. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her defiance. They were on a remote part of her property. No one would hear her scream. The tall one dismounted and grabbed her horse's bridle. "Maybe we ought to show you just how dangerous it is," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He reached for her, his grimy hand, intending to pull her from the saddle. "That's far enough." The voice was low, calm, and carried an authority that made all three of them freeze. Luther Beck stepped out from behind a rocky outcrop not 50 feet away. He held no weapon, only a length of thick rope in one hand. He had been checking her fence line, as he now did every day. The two thugs exchanged an amused glance, while now the tall one chuckled. "The town idiots come to play hero." "You'd best move along, friend," the shorter one warned, resting his hand on the butt of his pistol. "This ain't your concern." "You are on Mrs. Sheridan's land," Luther said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "That makes it my concern." The tall thug let go of Mabel's bridle and took a step toward Luther. "I'm tired of talking." He drew his pistol with practiced speed. What happened next was a blur of motion, so swift it defied belief. The simple handyman moved with the explosive speed and precision of a predator. As the thug raised his pistol, Luther flicked his wrist. The rope uncoiled the weighted end, striking the man's gun hand with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from his grasp as he howled in pain. Before the second man could even react, Luther closed the distance between them. He grabbed the man's gun arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed his head against his own saddle horn. The man crumpled to the ground unconscious. The tall thug, clutching his broken hand, stared at Luther in disbelief and terror. Who are you?" he stammered. Luther's entire demeanor had changed. The placid, slow-moving handyman was gone. In his place stood a man of cold, focused intensity. His language when he spoke was no longer simple or deliberate. It was articulate and authoritative. "I'm the man who's going to make you tell me who hired you," Luther said, his voice like chips of ice. He advanced on the terrified thug who scrambled backward on the ground. Mabel sat on her horse, stunned into silence. This was not the Luther she knew. This was a different man, entirely a trained fighter who had dispatched two armed professionals with brutal, terrifying efficiency. Luther bound the conscious thug with a rope, his knots swift and expert. He then turned to Mabel, his expression softening, the cold intensity replaced by concern. The shift was so complete, it was disorienting. "Are you all right, Mabel?" he asked, his voice now gentle again. She could only nod her mind, struggling to process what she had just witnessed. "Luther, how did you—" He looked down at the two groaning men on the ground, then back at her. The time for hiding was over. "My name isn't Luther Beck," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's Lucas Thorne. I was a Pinkerton agent for 8 years. Mabel stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, his keen observations, his hidden intelligence, his physical prowess. It all made a terrible, brilliant sense. The case went bad, he explained, his eyes filled with a deep, old pain. A good man died because of a mistake I made. I couldn't live with it. So I disappeared, became someone else. I came to Redemption Ridge for a quiet life, a simple life. I never meant to get involved in anything." He looked at her, his gaze direct and honest. "But I cannot stand by and watch an injustice like this unfold. I couldn't stand by and let them harm you." The revelation was a seismic shock, reshaping the very ground beneath her feet. Luther Beck, the man she had pitied and then befriended, was a lie. And Lucas Thorne, the man standing before her, was a protector, a partner. Her quiet, charitable relationship with the town simpleton had just transformed into a dangerous alliance with a former Pinkerton agent. And their fight against Wyatt Carter had just become infinitely more perilous. The alliance between Mabel and Lucas Thorne, born of violence and revelation, solidified in the quiet hours that followed. Lucas took the two thugs to a remote line shack on the edge of the Sheridan property. By morning, the one with the broken hand had told him everything Wyatt Carter had paid them, first for the robbery, then for the intimidation. He'd even paid a bonus for them to retrieve the silver pocket watch, knowing it would wound Mabel personally. Now they had a confession, but it was the word of a hired criminal against a wealthy, respected banker. They needed proof. Working together, they began to piece together Wyatt's scheme. Lucas, shedding his simple persona, revealed a sharp, analytical mind. He guided Mabel, teaching her how to look for patterns, how to connect disparate pieces of information. They discovered that 2 other ranches in the valley had been foreclosed on in the last year under suspicious circumstances. Both had suffered a string of bad luck fences, cut wells, mysteriously fouled livestock, falling ill just before the bank called in their loans. Wyatt had bought both properties for a fraction of their worth through a holding company registered in another territory. The ledger Mabel had found detailing these acquisitions was their first piece of concrete evidence. But as they drew closer to the truth, Wyatt escalated his attack. He could no longer rely on hired thugs. He needed to use the law itself as a weapon. One of the thugs Lucas had captured managed to escape the line shack and ride straight to Sheriff Bradley, telling a story of being brutally assaulted and held captive by the crazed simpleton Luther Beck. Wyatt, feigning civic concern, backed up the story, providing a witness who claimed to have seen Luther threatening the men. Sheriff Bradley, overwhelmed and bound by the letter of the law, had no choice. He rode out to the Sheridan Ranch with a warrant. Christmas was just 3 days away. Lucas, Mabel said, her voice filled with dread as she saw the sheriff's posse approaching. "It's all right," Lucas said calmly, though his eyes were grim. "Don't fight them. It's what he wants." He put his hand on her arm. "He's trying to isolate you. Don't let him win. Keep digging." Sheriff Bradley arrested Lucas for assault and kidnapping. As he was led away in handcuffs, he no longer looked like Luther Beck. He stood tall, his gaze clear and intelligent, a silent promise passing between him and Mabel. The townspeople who gathered to watch the spectacle saw only the village idiot finally showing his true, violent colors. They saw a vindication of their prejudices. With Lucas in jail, Mabel felt utterly alone. That evening, Wyatt Carter came to her door. The pretense of courtship was gone. His face was a cold, hard mask of triumph. "I believe you'll find your options have narrowed considerably," he said, stepping into her kitchen without an invitation. "It's time to be sensible." "What you did to him was monstrous," Mabel said, her voice trembling with rage. "What I did was necessary," Wyatt countered. "He was a complication. Now the path is clear. You will marry me on Christmas Eve." "Never." Wyatt laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "You still think you have a choice." He walked to her fireplace, staring into the flames. "You think this is about land, about money? You have no idea what this is about, do you?" He turned to face her, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "This is about your husband, Thomas Sheridan." The name hit her like a physical blow. What about Thomas? "Years ago, before I came to Redemption Ridge, my father was a successful merchant in St. Louis. His partner, his most trusted friend, was Thomas Sheridan's father. And then one day, they brought in a new investor, a young man with big ideas and a charming smile, your husband." Wyatt's voice grew thick with a lifetime of resentment. "Thomas convinced them to invest everything in a railroad speculation. He handled all the books, and when it all collapsed, the money was gone. Vanished. My father was ruined, disgraced. The Sheridans claim they lost everything too, but they managed to buy this land and start over. My family was left with nothing. He took a step closer, his face contorted by a bitter fury. The shame of it killed my father. He took his own life, leaving a note that said he'd been betrayed by his friend. Thomas Sheridan destroyed my family. He took everything from me. Mabel stared at him horrified. I don't believe you. Thomas was an honorable man. He was a thief, Wyatt snarled. And I made a promise on my father's grave that I would take back what was stolen from me. I would take everything Thomas Sheridan ever loved. Everything he ever built. His gaze swept around the small, warm kitchen, his precious ranch, his beloved wife, his only son. The full, monstrous scope of his plan was laid bare. This wasn't business. It wasn't greed. It was a twisted, personal vendetta. The foreclosure, the marriage proposal, it was all a meticulously crafted revenge designed not just to ruin her, but to desecrate the memory of her husband by possessing everything he held dear. He wanted to own her son, to erase Thomas Sheridan from the land he loved and replace him completely. The Sheridan promise was not a prize to him. It was a trophy. Christmas Eve descended on Redemption Ridge not with peace, but with the fury of a blizzard. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, driven by a howling wind that clawed at the walls of every building. The town was cut off an island in a sea of white. Inside the Gilded Cage saloon, a fire roared in the hearth, but it could not warm the chill that had settled over Mabel Sheridan. Wyatt Carter was celebrating his imminent victory with the town council secure in the knowledge that Lucas was locked in the town's jail, and Mabel was finally broken. He was wrong. Before his arrest, Lucas had devised a desperate plan, a final gamble that rested entirely on Mabel's courage. She pushed open the saloon doors, the wind and snow swirling in behind her. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. She was not dressed as a bride, but as a warrior. In her hands, she held the ledger she and Lucas had found. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice ringing with clarity above the storm's roar, "your time is up." The saloon was dimly lit, shadows dancing on the walls. The only sounds were the howling wind and the slow, deliberate ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick a hammer blow counting down the final moments. "Mabel, my dear," Wyatt said, recovering his composure with a condescending smile. "This is hardly the time or place. We have a wedding to prepare for." "There will be no wedding," she declared. She walked to the center of the room and placed the ledger on the poker table. "This ledger details your fraudulent acquisition of the Miller and Patterson ranches. It shows a pattern of sabotage followed by foreclosure, the same pattern you tried to use on me." She looked at the faces of the councilmen. "He didn't just rob the bank. He's been robbing this entire valley." Wyatt laughed. "An interesting story. But it's nothing but a desperate woman's fantasy. You have no proof." "Don't she?" a deep voice rumbled from behind the bar. Calvin Sawyer stepped forward, a sawed-off shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. "I overheard you hiring those thugs from Blackstone, Wyatt. The first time I thought it was just business. But when you sent them after her a second time, that's not business. That's evil." He looked at Mabel with newfound respect. I couldn't let it stand, and I wasn't the only one who felt that way. As he spoke, the back door of the saloon opened. Lucas Thorne stepped into the room, no longer the shuffling, simple Luther Beck, but a man who moved with purpose and confidence. The snow melted on his shoulders as he calmly closed the door behind him. The cell door in Sheriff Bradley's jailhouse is old. Lucas said, his voice articulate and clear, stunning the councilman into silence. The lock was surprisingly easy to pick. Wyatt stared, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He was exposed, his plan crumbling around him. In a flash of desperate fury, he drew a concealed derringer from his coat pocket and lunged for Mabel, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "It's all his fault," Wyatt screamed, his voice cracking the veneer of the calm businessman, stripped away to reveal the raw wound beneath. "Thomas Sheridan was a thief who destroyed my family. He took everything. This is justice." "It's a lie," Wyatt Lucas said, his voice cutting through the man's frantic rage. "Everything you believe is a lie." Wyatt hesitated, his grip on Mabel tightening. "What are you talking about?" "After my last case with the Pinkertons, I spent a year investigating financial crimes. I made it my specialty," Lucas explained calmly, taking a slow step forward. "So when Mabel told me your story, I sent a telegraph to a former colleague in St. Louis. I had him pull the records on your father's old partnership." The wind howled outside, a mournful chorus to the unfolding tragedy. Thomas Sheridan and his father lost everything, just like they said. Lucas revealed, his voice filled with a quiet authority that commanded belief. The money wasn't stolen by them. It was embezzled piece by piece over 2 years by your own father to pay his gambling debts. The suicide note wasn't a confession of betrayal. It was a final desperate act of a guilty man framing his partner to protect his own name. The final truth landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Wyatt's entire life, his quest for revenge, the hatred that had fueled him for years, was all built on a pathetic lie. The man he had spent his life avenging was the true villain of his story. Shattered by the revelation, Wyatt's face crumpled. His grip on Mabel slackened, his eyes staring into a void of his own making. In that moment of hesitation, Lucas moved. He lunged forward, striking Wyatt's arm and sending the derringer skittering across the floor. The saloon doors burst open, and Sheriff Bradley stood there, his face humbled and grim. He had seen Calvin Sawyer heading to the jail and had followed, arriving just in time to hear the final confession. Without a word, he moved past the stunned councilman and took Wyatt Carter, a broken and defeated man, into custody. As the heavy oak doors of the gilded cage swung shut behind the sheriff and his prisoner, the grandfather clock began to chime midnight. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the saloon, the storm had finally broken. It was Christmas Day. In the quiet days that followed, the snowstorm subsided, leaving Redemption Ridge blanketed in a pristine, silent white. The town emerged, changed, blinking in the bright winter sun. The story of Wyatt Carter's vendetta and Lucas Thorne's true identity spread faster than a prairie fire. Mabel Sheridan was no longer seen as a helpless widow, but as a woman of formidable strength and unwavering conviction. Calvin Sawyer, his conscience cleared, approached her with a proposition that held no hidden agenda. He offered her a fair long-term loan from his own savings, enough to stabilize the ranch and see her through to the spring cattle drive. "Consider it the town's apology," he'd said, his voice gruff with sincerity. Sheriff Bradley came to her porch, hat in hand. He formally apologized to both Mabel and to Lucas, his tired eyes holding a new respect. "I judged a man by his cover," he admitted. "It's a mistake I won't make again." Lucas, who the town now tentatively called by his real name, explained that his past as a Pinkerton was behind him. Redemption Ridge, a place he had chosen for its quiet anonymity, had unexpectedly become a home. He wished to stay. During a quiet moment by the fire, he pressed a small, heavy object into Mabel's hand. It was Thomas's silver watch. I recovered it from one of the thugs before the sheriff took them away, he said softly. I had Calvin hold on to it for me. Mabel's fingers closed around the cool metal. The watch was dented from its rough handling, but it was whole. She turned the small key, and to her amazement, it began to tick a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the palm of her hand. A piece of her past had been returned to her, not as a source of pain, but as a symbol of survival. Weeks later, the Sheridan Promise was beginning to live up to its name. Under Mabel's savvy management and Lucas's tireless work, the ranch was thriving. The fences were strong, the barn roof was patched, and a sense of hope had returned to the land. Lucas was her partner in every sense of the word, in both work and in life, his quiet strength a constant and welcome presence. One crisp February afternoon, Mabel stood in her sunlit home. She took Thomas's watch, now polished and gleaming, from her pocket. For weeks she had carried it, a link to the man she had lost. Now, with a heart full of peace, she placed it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a symbolic act, a quiet ceremony of honoring her past while fully embracing her future. The steady ticking no longer sounded like a countdown, but like a promise of the good years to come. Just then, Denver ran in from outside, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyes bright with excitement. He held up a small, intricately carved wooden horse. "Look," he shouted. "Lucas helped me make it. It looks just like thunder." Mabel smiled, her heart swelling. Her family was whole again, not replaced, but reborn into something new and strong. The clatter of hooves announced the arrival of the mail rider. He handed a single letter to Lucas, addressed to Mr. Lucas Thorne. Lucas opened it, his expression unreadable, as he scanned the official-looking script. It was from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. They had learned of his role in exposing Wyatt Carter and were offering him a full pardon for his desertion, along with an offer of reinstatement at a senior rank. He read the letter through once, then a second time. He looked at Mabel, her face framed by the warm light of her home. He looked at Denver, who was happily making his wooden horse gallop across the kitchen table. He saw his future not in the accolades of a past life, but in the simple, profound peace of this room. Calmly, he walked to the fireplace. He folded the letter and slid it into the heart of the crackling flames. He watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, taking his old life with it. His new life was here.